The main body of the figure of Kronos is a much wider space with more room to work, of course. When mold making, we could use pretty large pieces of fiber on this part, but now that we are working on the inside of the mold casting, we can't really do that as the surface is full of undulations that my fiberglass won't play nice with. So we need a bunch of smaller pieces of fiberglass here to get around the rather complex interior of this mold. This is pretty standard when doing casting versus when doing mold making, so it's not something that's strictly speaking only coming down to the complexity of this mold in particular. It's something you'll likely encounter no matter what kind of mold you are casting with it. In order to make sure I work in an orderly and controlled fashion, I tend to remove only a few pieces of fiber at the same time before brushing resin into that section of the mold. The resin is of the same consistency as when we worked on the arms and legs, right around the thickness of milk or heavy cream. I remove a few pieces of fiber ahead of where I'm working. I'll brush resin into that area of the mold and place the pieces of fiber back into the resin. Whenever I have two pieces of fiber overlapping, which I have everywhere for strength of course, I make sure to brush some resin onto the edge of the fiber that's about to get overlapped, so that the new piece of fiber will stick to it and not just lay on top of it, with no resin in between the two, which of course would mean they are not joined together, which of course would mean there's no strength in our mold. To be organized, I do my best to not remove too many pieces of fiber at once, because it will get very hard to remember where they were supposed to go back into the mold, as a lot of the pieces of fibers are pretty generic and not so specific as to the shape of the inside of the mold. I also try to make sure that the fibers that are removed from the mold are placed outside the mold in a similar orientation to how they were placed inside the mold. This way, it's much easier to remember where they need to go and how they need to get there when you are placing the fiberglass back into the mold. And all the work we did pre-cutting pieces of fiberglass is not lost because you took all your fiberglass pieces out of the mold and it turned into a mess and now you can't figure out which one goes where, which I could easily see happening unless we pay attention to this issue. Just placing the fiberglass down into the mold on top of an area with fresh resin applied is not really enough, however. We do need to do some more work to make sure the pieces of fiber are properly laid down on the inside surface of our casting. This is the very delicate and careful work of pushing on the fiberglass, using a light touch to tamp it down properly into the mold so that there are no pockets of air in between the layers. Air pockets can pop from the outside of the casting if it's bumped or pushed at, squeezed or whatever, and you could get a hole on the surface of your casting and the layer of fiberglass would be showing through that hole. We'd like to avoid this issue, of course. This step is mostly going to be labor and it's going to take a bit of time. It's a lot of ground to cover here. It is, however, important to stay focused, as working clean still is important. I find that whenever we lose focus, we tend to make a mess, and we don't want that, since we'd really like to make sure that this mold closes without us needing to fuss around and figure out where we overbuilt the resin and then rasp it down. Which I had to do a little bit of anyways, but you'd like to minimize that sort of work, since it's no fun and it's essentially fixing mistakes that should have been avoided to begin with. In addition to that, rasping or sanding resin is really hard work, and using a Dremel, which you could do, kicks up a ton of dust, which is not good for you and is not great for your studio. Brushing a ton over the top of these fiberglass pieces once they've been laid down is not really recommended, since they can be kind of pushed and pulled around by the brush. It can be hard to keep track of where the fiber is and where it isn't, and so once it's been laid down inside the mold, I try not to mess with it too much until the resin sets up, locking the fiberglass in place. And I probably should have mentioned this earlier, but we will be using one layer of fiberglass for the casting. It doesn't need to be as strong as the mother mold, so one layer of fiber is going to be enough. I mentioned during the second layer of hydro-resin that the idea with that layer was to help the fiberglass by having an even surface to lay down onto. I also mentioned trying to keep the layers of resin at an even thickness. Now, these two are of course going to compete with each other, and the only way, or rather the best way to do this, is to consider both and allow both to apply. This means that, for example, in the portrait of this sculpture, we have filled the ears, the nose, and any other deep crevasses with resin. This does of course mean that the resin is thicker in some areas than in others, so it's not even. The fiberglass would never lay down nicely and evenly in tight spaces like ears, nose, and eyes, especially not on this scale anyway, so we had to do that. It's hard to explain exactly when to break the rules and when to follow them, but I think you would do well by considering both advices and considering which one to follow where. Sculpture and mold making is filled to the brim with competing advice, and it can be hard to navigate this as a beginner. Sometimes you have to use your gut instinct and do what makes sense to you. And I think in doing so, you'll discover over time what works and what doesn't work.